Hello, students. I'm making this video for JMS701 in spring 2024. I might use it in other semesters as well. I'm doing this kind of in a rush. I got some other things going on right now, but I wanted to get this information out to help you put context to some of the stuff we will be discussing at the next class meeting. Inshallah, it means God willing, you will watch this before you do the readings, or even if you watch this after you do the readings, maybe it'll provide you some additional context. I'm going to talk about two readings. I'm not going to talk about the reading, the theories of media evolution or whatever that is called, because I discussed that in the last class meeting. That recording is on Canvas if you want to get those bullet point notes that I went over. But central to these two readings that I'm going to talk about is the concept of social construction of technology, the idea that the way technologies develop, it's not inevitable, predetermined, or kind of written in stone from the beginning, that societies and cultures influence the technologies that develop. And we're going to talk specifically about radio broadcasting. Susan Smulyan, in the introduction to Selling Radio, does mention technological determinism, if you picked up on that in the introduction. And that's what she's exploring in that. But I'm also exploring that as well in the thing that I wrote about the New York Herald wireless telegraphy station. Okay, here we go. And normally for a graduate seminar, I would not do a video lecture like this or any kind of formal presentation, but these are slides that I already have because I've been teaching and talking about radio for a long time. So I kind of piece these together from other classes. Some historical background. Marconi introduces his system for wireless telegraphy. That's what it was called, not radio, wireless telegraphy, in a very big public way. 1899 comes to the United States. The New York Herald has him use his technology to cover a yacht race. Actually, a boat that had wireless telegraph on it was sending signals back to shore, picked up by a wireless telegraph station on shore, and then it's transmitted through a combination of means to the New York Herald newspaper headquarters in New York City. And the reason that this is important is this was, he had done this a year before over in Ireland with the yacht race, but this was a really, really big public exposure to the technology and introduced the United States that, hey, you can now send signals without wire. What I want to stress here is that Marconi was not trying to invent the system of radio as it later came to be. He was trying to take business away from the wired telegraph businesses of the time, right? The telegraph already existed. You could send communication instantly or nearly instantly over long distance if you had a physical cable connecting them. And there were underwater telegraph cables. I think they're called submarine cables under water, even under the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah, even under the Atlantic Ocean. So the companies that had these submarine cables could charge a great deal of money because they had this amazing ability to transmit over great distances, but you had to pay them. Marconi wanted to disrupt that industry, to use that term, by coming up with a rival technology that could send signals over water without having a physical connection. However, if you think about the telegraph, it is point to point communication, meaning, one sender in one location communicates with one station or one person in another area. It's just, New York to Chicago. It's not New York sending out a signal to everyone in the Northeast. It's point to point communication. So the original idea for wireless telegraphy, that it was a system of point to point communication. The fact that the signal goes in every direction and can be picked up by anyone listening was actually thought to be a drawback. And it wasn't until later that people realized that that was the benefit of the technology, not a flaw of the technology. The New York Herald, which let me move myself a little bit here. Yeah, I think this is a headline from 1901. The New York Herald, which had commissioned Marconi to come over, actually pays him to install a wireless station on a boat. The boat was anchored, so it wasn't floating around, but it was on water. And this graphic illustration here shows here, way over here, out, it comes off Martha's Vineyard, the coast of Martha's Vineyard. There's I think that's a wired cable This last leg, this one point of the communication chain is actually wireless. So the boat out here in the ocean could see ships coming from Europe sooner than if you had to wait till they came all the way into New York, right? You could actually get like a 1 day jump on the news, and information coming from the boats. It could even be flags. It could even be like semaphore code. It could be picked up and actually sent. Uh, so it goes from wireless over here to a station here, and then there's a system of landline telegraphs and some submarine cables here going all the way back to New York City. So the New York Herald could get like a 1 day jump on information from other newspapers. That was the point of it. And the article that I wrote, News on the Air, is about the New York Herald and their embracement of wireless telegraphy. And there's an article, I think it's quoted, or a letter, I think it's quoted very at the beginning of my article, that someone is speculating that this is the first radio station in the United States. It's the first permanent facility established for the sending and receiving of wireless signals. I'm not going to say anything's the first. That's a tricky term, but it is pretty interesting. Here I found some more headlines just to kind of illustrate something discussed in the article. The New York Herald does this experiment in 1907 where they're transmitting stock market and financial information to rich people who are cruising around harbor in New York, going around Manhattan in their yachts. I just think this is a fascinating idea, that it shows that the motive for creating this new cutting edge form of technology is rich dudes want to stay in touch with the stock market. Here I just took another close up of that image. I think that's a goat or a lamb. I don't know. There's some symbology here that I'm not getting. And these are the codes that they were using. They weren't transmitting. Again, it's Morse code. Okay, if I didn't, yeah, we're not broadcasting voice and music. We're broadcasting Morse code, which had been developed for the telegraph. They're just using that wirelessly. Morse code was not only was it dots and dashes, but they also abbreviated words and made things very short. Rather than transmit out a whole sentence, you could do 2 or 3 letters, which would stand for something. That was very common with the telegraph. Wireless telegraphy picked that up. And then here we have the codes that the New York Herald is using to say, hey, the spring wheat crop is good, it's going to go up, or the total wheat is the same, that price is not going to change. I just think it's amazing that they came up with so many codes for this experiment. Here is a photograph. I think this is from like 1910, 1911, something like that. I'm sure the article has the exact citation from the book that this is from, the New York Herald station. Yeah, very soon after the Wall Street float experiments, the New York Herald has this wireless station, which is transmitting out via Morse code stock market information, baseball scores, news of the day to the ships that had wireless receivers on them. So I specified that the original model of wireless telegraphy was point to point communication. But here we have a newspaper that is doing broadcasting. Okay. They are sending out a signal indiscriminately to anyone in the area that could happen to pick it up. When historians typically look at radio history, they typically overlook everything that happened before 1920 as being a prehistory, as being not important. And the argument that I've tried to make in this article and other things that I've written is that we should look at a continuity of practice rather than discrepancy. Media evolution happens not by sort of dramatic paradigm shift, but it is a more gradual process. It's more complicated to unravel that process, but I just think that's ultimately more accurate. So the New York Herald is doing essentially what is broadcasting before it's really called broadcasting, and before the term radio is what's used. So that's what I'm trying to explore in that article, is that there's a continuity of practice, and then also explore some of the challenges that government regulators faced when they were trying to deal with this new form of technology, that the law wasn't able to deal with yet. Here, I found this totally random. I can't believe I found this headline from Buffalo Evening News, 1909, and it lists a number of radio stations that were connected, excuse me, a number of wireless stations, excuse me, a number of wireless stations that were connected to newspapers in 1909. My last visit to the National Archives many years ago, looking at old FCC files, I was digging around and trying to find any kind of government record about any of these. I couldn't find a one. Um, what I'm thinking is that the government records are organized by who owned the license for the wireless station, and it probably was not, or in fact, I'm sure it was not the newspaper. It wasn't the Boston Evening News or the paper in Boston or the paper in Chicago. It belonged to something like Federal Telegraph or something like that. So the government records are not archived in such a way that I could track down any kind of information about these. But this headline, I don't believe, this is not a deep fake. Okay, this is real. I believe that these newspapers had press stations, and we knew the New York Herald existed. That's the one that has the most documentation, including my article. So anyway, I think this is a great little thing. I found it accidentally, but it shows that yes, this form of using wireless telegraphy did exist, although we can't really study it because we don't know where the records are, and it's hard to retrace that history. I get, this is just sort of like, a personal note here. I got interested in the New York Herald because I had previously done research about department stores that owned radio stations and wireless telegraph stations. Marconi had a wireless station in Wanamaker's department store. Um, that was announced in 1909, didn't open till about 1911. So the Philadelphia department store could communicate with the New York department store. The purpose of the communication was for just sort of internal, mundane communications, like, hey, we're out of socks, send more women's hats, whatever. That was the point. But it was also for publicity, that you could attract people into the store, have them come and look at this thing, and they could see the wireless telegraph operators doing their job. It was a way for the department store just to promote itself. And they even advertised that if you were coming from Europe, sailing into New York, you could send a message, and then New York would send it to Philadelphia or vice versa or something like that. Anyway, yeah, this one says it's Philadelphia is the first one, but they had one in Philadelphia and in New York. Um, anyway, when I was researching this, yeah, back to my point. When I was researching this, because I was already doing department stores, I found out about this New York Herald station. And that kind of struck me. I was like, that is important. That is important. The department store is what I'm doing now, but my next research project ought to be about the newspaper, New York Herald. That's why I did that. Okay, some historical context. The Titanic. The Titanic. I know y'all are familiar with the Titanic. You've seen the movie. Um, was actually a big issue with radio history, in that most other countries had already started to regulate the technology, realizing that this was very valuable and very beneficial. And they had already recognized, Germany was like the leader here, recognized that if you have two different transmitters operating on the same frequency, the way airwaves work, they're going to drown each other out, and you need some type of regulation. So the government, the Congress had already started to draft regulation that, hey, ships of a certain size carrying a certain number of people ought to have this technology on it. Um, the sinking of the Titanic, when it was discovered that many people could have been saved if more vessels had wireless receiving equipment. When this was announced, Congress finally acted and passed the Radio Act of 1912. But just to be clear, the Radio Act of 1912 had been written before the Titanic sank. That was the motivation to pass it. What had happened was the Titanic was sending out distress signals with a wireless receiver. The closest vessel had a wireless receiver, but that person was off for the night. The Marconi company had like a monopoly over it at the time. And one of the rules were people only worked like 12 hours and got nights off, which made sense, but there was no one to relieve this other person at night. So if more vessels nearby had wireless equipment and people working, we could have saved a lot more people. So a lot of provisions are established in the 1912 Radio Act, including ships of a certain size need to, have people working the equipment. Um, and this is important. This is not discussed in the Smulyan book, but this is actually important. We get the beginnings of frequency allocation with the 1912 Radio Act. Okay. With the 1912 Radio Act, the government comes in and establishes itself as the traffic cop of the airwaves, assigning different users different portions of the electromagnetic spectrum. The amateur operators, um, early radio was a very, very technical hobby. A lot of men did it. Boy Scouts were very involved. The classic example is a man going out to his garage, tinkering with electronic equipment, making his own equipment, trying to communicate over great distances with other amateur operators. If you know about ham radio, that's essentially the continuation of this technological and social practice. Okay, the amateur operators are told to broadcast on the shortwave frequencies, which at the time were thought to be not very good, not very usable. That later turned out to be not the case. Um, Maritime distress signals get their own unique frequency. This is where you send your maritime distress signal. This is where you listen to possibly receive them. The government gets a huge chunk of the airwave spectrum. The U.S. Navy, because of needing to communicate with boats, was the leader government agency. And then the longer waves, which were thought to be better for sending over long distances, go to commercial companies. The Marconi company was by far the dominant company. There were other people using wireless telegraph equipment, but Marconi company was the biggest one. Um, and the Smulyan reading does talk about sort of corporate battles and patent battles and who has the rights to this. That situation was very, very severe before World War One, and that really hindered the technology. The fact that you had so many corporations fighting each other, but the Marconi company was able to sort of win most of those battles. All right, in the 1912 Radio Act, this is not part of the Smulyan reading, but it is discussed in the New York Herald reading. There was a provision that if there's a national crisis, the U.S. Navy is going to get exclusive control over this technology. World War One happens, the U.S. gets involved with World War One, the Navy exerts control and says, we own the airwaves, no one can transmit or even listen. That was kind of amazing. You can even put on headphones and connect to an antenna and listen to wireless signals, because the U.S. Navy was the one that was supposed to be doing that. And one of another research project I did was in the government archives. I found all these letters people had written, basically ratting out their neighbors, saying, "Hey, I think so and so has a funny accent. I think he's got a secret wireless receiver." Um, the main concern was Germany was sending signals to spies in the United States. And I found this letter. You can see the stamps on it from the National Archives. I think that's the Bureau of Navigation up here. And the Bureau of Navigation regulated radio, and the Department of Commerce before the Federal Radio Commission was established. Person saying, "Hey, look, this German farm, you can't get more German than Schwarzkopf and Schwarzkopf. They've got a wireless receiver. You need to come bust these people." Anyway, I found these articles and wrote a research paper about that area of research. And then here is a promotional or propaganda poster. Can I use that term? Can I use that term with y'all? Um, Basically telling all these radio amateur operators that you can no longer practice this radio hobby that you like, but if you join, at this point, join the Navy and the Naval Reserve, you can, learn this technology. And the U.S. military and the U.S. Navy had an unbelievably profound effect on the evolution of radio technology. I mentioned that there was these different patent battles and different fights over who owned which aspect of the technology. The Navy said, "We don't care. We're at war. We're going to take everything. We'll sort it out later. Right now, we're going to figure out the absolute best way to communicate over long distances." And you kind of appreciate that utilitarian mindset. We're just going to get it done. We're going to get the job done. And vacuum tubes started to be developed and other ways to send voice and music over the airwaves. So previously it's dots and dashes of Morse code. Now you could actually send voice, and just talk to people. which is a much more effective way of communication. You can also transmit over long distances now. There's a tremendous amount of these radio equipment that's developed, and you get all these people trained in the technology. So after World War One, we get the birth of radio broadcasting as we now know the term. To me, it was a pretty direct result of all the innovations that the US military had been doing. Okay, back to the sort of the legal industrial part of the story. Um, I don't think this is discussed in the Smulyan reading at all. After World War One, an American company is trying to sell this new alternator, big powerful piece of technology, to the Marconi company, which was really headquartered in England. Marconi's mom was British, and so he was able to use those family connections to get England to sort of endorse him before his dad was Italian, but that's how he ended up in England, and that's how England ended up leading the way with wireless. Anyway, British Marconi Company is going to get the sort of great power, and they're going to be, global dominance when it comes to wireless communication. The U.S. Navy says no, no, no. So even though the Navy was no longer in control of radio after World War One, they're able to tell enough politicians that no, 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 you can't let some foreign company have this power. It's got to be in the U.S. So the government persuades. I don't know how they did it. I don't know how they did it, but they basically persuade uh, British Marconi to sell off the American branch of the company, American Marconi, to create the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, which later creates NBC, which still exists today. So there's a clear chain from British Marconi to American Marconi that's spun off. That becomes the Radio Corporation of America. So you have all this, and now this is kind of where we get into the Smulyan reading. We have all these excess military equipment, excess military people who know this technology. You have a lot of amateur operators. That cult of practice picks up again after the war, sending and receiving signals. Frank Conrad, this guy outside of Pittsburgh, who was in one branch in the military, I think the Signal Corps, and he's using leftover military equipment. He figures out he can play records, Victrola records on, the old ancient phonograph, right? He can play music over the airwaves. A department store, Pitts Conrad's, what was it? Horns. Yeah, Horns. Can't believe I forgot that. Horns department store takes out an ad saying that, we picked up music over the airwaves. You can listen to music over the airwaves for free. If you have this device, you can listen to music for free, and our department store is a place to do it. So the department store is promoting the technology as as a promotional vehicle. Come into our department store, and while you're here, buy a kit to make your own radio receiver. That's an important part of it. But while you're here, buy a kit to make a radio receiver. As the legend goes, which I do believe is true, this guy from Westinghouse sees this and has this light bulb moment. So you have these different corporations, including Westinghouse, experimenting with the technology, trying to figure out what they're going to do with wireless telegraphy. They're still thinking about it as point-to-point communication, right? Remember that from a couple minutes ago? They're still thinking about that model. Frank Conrad says, no, Conrad was the one who started it. Westinghouse says, hey, let's start a whole chain of radio stations. We're not going to transmit directly to individuals. We're going to send music and entertainment out into the airwaves, and anyone who wants to listen to it can listen to it. And we will make money by manufacturing those receivers. That's the business model. We will manufacture a receiver so that you can listen to free music. We will provide the free music just because we want you to buy that thing, just because we want you to buy that receiver. So this ad from a department store triggers this massive change in the way the media technology we now know as radio is developed. It is from an advertisement. It is from an advertisement. Following the, and this is, I think, where the Smulyan book picks up, following this, KDKA was the station. KDKA was the station in Pittsburgh. Following this successful Westinghouse experiment with the department store, many individuals start opening their own radio stations, and they call it a boom or an explosion. It was a pretty dramatic growth period. The government regulations aren't effective because remember, in that last slide I talked about government regulations were developed like after 1912 Radio Act. They're thinking of radio as something you use for maritime distress primarily. And there was a special frequency for broadcasting maritime distress signals, and a couple frequencies average people were supposed to use. Everyone's put on the same frequency because they just weren't equipped for the new way the technology was developing. So you actually had radio stations sharing time. You get it Monday, Tuesday, you get it Thursday, Friday. That didn't work very well. Through my own research, I discovered a number of conflicts where stations were broadcasting on the not correct night, drowning each other out. And you have many different companies creating radio stations and institutions for a variety of reasons: publicity, promotion, educational outreach. That was kind of the idea. And then you had a number of companies that were trying to sell the radio receivers. Here is just to kind of illustrate the race to create radio stations. There's an ad from 1922. In Philadelphia, four different department stores, four different department stores all created their own radio stations, and they were racing with one another to be first. March 18th, 1922 was supposed to be the day that two radio stations were going to go on the air, one by Gimbals, that was WIP, Gimbals at WIP, and then Strawbridge and Clothier, WFIL. Yeah, that was their call letters, had WFIL. They were both supposed to go on the air at the same day and trade off the hours. I think this is genius. Gimbals takes out this ad that said yesterday's broadcasting was most successful. So they're telling their rivals, hey, we already did it yesterday. And then the other department store responds the next week specifying, and this is an ad, a department store ad from the newspaper, that, we were the first to give practical radio demonstrations. We were the first to receive a government permit, and we were the first to receive the government license. I don't know who was the first in Philadelphia. These arguments over first radio station are notorious, and there's no answer. Even KDKA Pittsburgh, which I mentioned, is not really the first. It depends on how you want to define things. There was a station in Detroit that has a good claim to it. Or if you want to go way back to the start of this little video lecture, you could say that NYHerald thing on a boat off Nantucket Shoals was the first, right? And this is just not part of the reading at all. I just threw this in. Gimbel's New York store had a radio station that actually broadcast for the public, where the public could actually watch as early as 1924. Now, the public was watching behind glass, but I think it's pretty amazing that this is like the first radio studio for public performances is in a department store, and everything that you see you could also purchase. Like, hey, look at that person, he's reading a bedtime story, and you could buy that chair, you could buy that vase, right? You could buy that desk. Okay, all right, I already mentioned that a great many types of individuals, businesses, institutions open their own radio stations. Here is a study from 1922. This was done by AT&T. The categorization was not done by me, but by their estimate, approximately a third of the radio stations that exploded between 1920 and 1922 were started by radio manufacturers or dealers. These are the people who want to sell the appliance of the radio receiver. So the programming is provided for free just for that reason. That's an interesting economic model. That is not a long-term model. That model is not going to sustain when you've got market saturation, but it is an interesting model. And then you could read down the list, and here you have department stores. I was the first person, probably the only person, to study the intersection of department stores and early radio. You have a lot of universities, a lot of newspapers, right? And that remains an interesting point of public debate as to, if a company owns the newspaper in town, should they also be able to own a radio and TV station? Does that give one entity too much voice. People have studied that. We have a lot of newspapers, and then you have another variety of things as well. I also want to say, I think 141 as miscellaneous is awful high. If your total N is only 576, to have a miscellaneous category that's 141 is pretty high. I would, love to get in there and see uh, what the actual data is. But anyway, you can see even from this system of categorization a variety of people opening radio stations. And this, again, just the historical side thrown in, an interactive promotion from 1922 from a department store, WOR in New Jersey. That was started by Bamberger's department store. The idea was that they print this grid, looks like a bingo card, in the local paper, and then they broadcast, B4, G7. And if you follow the instructions, you get a little picture. Then you could bring the picture, if correctly filled out, to the department store, and it's a coupon for something or a discount or something like that. I think this is really fascinating, and it's just another example of there's all these really interesting historical oddities and interesting ways to use media technology in the past. Many times the ideas aren't followed through, but I think that's a pretty cool, interesting little idea. Okay, now this is what the Smulyan book is talking about. We have all these institutions creating these different radio stations, businesses, but who's going to pay for it, right? I mentioned the one business plan of, hey, we'll put on free radio so you can buy the receiver. That's not going to work forever, right? Is radio supposed to be nonprofit? Is it supposed to be government funded? Almost every country in the world other than the United States went for some version of government funding, right? Almost every single country except the United States, recognizing that the power and potential of this form of electronic communication was vast. And if you leave it up to commercial entities, they could use it for their own purposes, which may not benefit the public. Is the form of media supposed to be listener supported? Okay, meaning, once a week or once a month, you voluntarily send in a check, and then you could receive the signal. This might work today with satellite radio, because with the technology, we can encrypt the signal so that only people who actually pay can listen to satellite radio. They didn't have this ability at the time. So if I can receive a radio signal for free and I don't have to pay for it, most people are just going to receive it for free. What we ended up with, and this is what the Smulyan book is about, is a commercial model where stations are independently owned and they sell airtime to another business. So the other business comes in and just says, I want 30 minutes of your airtime, an hour, 2 hours, whatever it might be. And then eventually I just want a minute. But the main company that owns a radio station is just existing to make a profit itself. They don't really care sometimes what's actually on the air. They're just selling the time to people. And department stores got out of the radio business pretty quickly within a decade or so because they realized it was just so expensive. And that if you're a department store, you can purchase airtime on an NBC or a CBS station. You don't need to have your own media operation, as it were. So the commercial model is what takes off in the United States. And here is something that's mentioned in the Smulyan reading. There was a lot of public debate in the early 20s. This is from a radio journal, Popular Radio, from 1922. People were quite vexed by this issue. Who's going to pay for this? And people did not like broadcast advertising. At least some evidence suggests some people did not like it. Did everyone dislike it? Did some people like it? These are interesting questions you have to piece together from fragmented historical data. So that's what the Smulyan book is about. And here, this is just an ad from that same issue of Popular Radio, this one comes from. In 1922, it was still a very, very technical hobby. It was throughout the 1920s, certainly by 1927, that radio becomes a sort of dumbed down, simplified, user-friendly technology where radio now becomes a piece of furniture, an Art Deco piece of furniture in your living room, as it were. But it was still a pretty technical hobby really didn't sort of become fully commercialized, fully entrenched in American life until 1927 or so. Okay, so we had this period of chaos for 6 or 7 years where radio stations are broadcasting on the same frequency, they're fighting with each other. You have some pretty, I think the Klan, the KKK even had its own radio station. You have very, very limited and pretty haphazard radio regulation. We can't control what's going on here. This is chaotic. There's a number of radio conferences. This is discussed in the Smulyan reading. In 1926, there was something called a spite lawsuit, right? I didn't know this term until I'd been researching the topic for a few years. Some guy in Chicago starts a radio station and deliberately broadcasts on a frequency he's not supposed to be using, causing a problem in order to trigger a lawsuit from the other party so that he can then file his own lawsuit and say, hey, the US government doesn't have regulation over this thing they claim to have regulation over. And it is this big court decision known as the 1926 Zenith decision. And the US courts ruled that the Radio Act did not actually allow the Department of Commerce and the Bureau of Navigation to be regulating radio in the way that they were doing it. So as a result, we get this big Federal Radio Act. And this is where beginning of sort of like modern media regulation comes from, the 1927 Radio Act. We established the Federal Radio Commission. It later becomes the Federal Communications Commission. There was a big Communications Act updating this one in 1934, but the model had been set. 1927 sets the model. And we have this terminology that the radio airwaves has to be used in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. The idea here is that if we, meaning the US government, are allowing an entity exclusive use of a particular frequency, this frequency ought to belong to the entire US public. It's like it's a national resource like water or forests or whatever, minerals or something, that you can't allow one person to use it exclusively for themselves. The benefits have to be shared with the whole public. So if we are giving you the use of a particular frequency, and this is when we really begin in a systematic way. Each radio station gets its own frequency. If we're giving you a frequency, you have to use it to benefit everyone. However, there was preferential treatment for NBC and CBS networks, meaning that the radio advertisers had already sort of taken off and they had already established themselves. They had already become entrenched before the Federal Radio Act, to be honest. The system was already in place. That commercial model was going to be the way of the future. So they were given better frequencies, allowed to operate at higher power. Church was told you can only operate at this much power. NBC can operate at a much higher level of power. So there was definitely government preference for the commercial system of broadcasting. And the book talks about, Smulyan's book talks about different models. Do we have a handful of high-powered stations? So maybe 3-4 stations operating at superpower, provide all the radio programming? Do we have lots of little stations? Are the stations connected by wires, or are they transmitting to each other through short waves? I actually need to read that part of the book to get more into that. What we end up with is a system of lots of local stations, not just 3 or 4 high power stations. We end up with lots of local stations. The idea being that each local community will have more local control over its local media outlet, which makes sense. It's great in theory. I understand that. That's not what happened in reality. In reality, NBC and CBS linked up each other. So you have all these local stations called affiliates, but they're operating by these big networks. So they're still broadcasting the same thing. So effectively, you have 2 or 3 high power stations blasting media to the United States, except it's just done through a bunch of little stations linked up. So you give the illusion of local control, but really the big national networks were in charge. So these are some of the bigger questions framing the Smulyan reading. Why, and we can discuss this is what I want to discuss, why did the US develop a commercial system of broadcasting? Why? Why? If everyone else in the world says government's the way to go, um, because it's too much power to leave to people selling soap and detergent, why did the US go the other way? And then what changes did advertising bring to radio programming? When you have people experimenting, and there's some different experiments discussed in the book, when it becomes clear that advertising is going to be the way to go, you get segmentation of the audience. You get women being targeted and being targeted in a specific way. Stay at home moms doing laundry. Let's program um, cooking tips and fashion tips to them, right? Um, what are some other changes that advertising brought? And was the control of the commercial system a top down? Was it manufactured by the elites? Was it bottom up? Did people want this? And this gets into the nature of social control and social formation. It's a, how is it that power reproduces itself in society, and that the status quo and those with power, how do they keep power systematically over time? Um, is it just, brute force domination, or do people welcome this? It's hegemony, some combination, but how exactly does that work? And that's what the Smulyan reading is really about, and that's what this topic is really about: the commercialization of American broadcasting. It's about social formation, how do cultures form, and then within that we'll learn about, interesting little tidbits about radio history. Anyway, I've talked longer than I thought I was going to, but hopefully you can watch this. Hopefully you will watch this. Hopefully it makes sense. And hopefully it provides some context to the reading. And I look forward to seeing y'all in person.